Where's my shot of Lagash? Right, so we'll go back to Lagash. We've seen Lagash before, right? Lagash, what comes from Lagash that we looked at actually for the midterm? It's one of your slide ideas.
Stele of the Vultures.
Right, Stele of the Vultures, right? This is where the Stele of the Vultures was, the Umma-Lagash conflict with Eonatum. In this case, Lagash has this history of independence. It was a very strong city-state, as we saw during the early dynastic period. And with the fall of the Akkadian Empire, it shifts back into political autonomy. We have the earliest texts that we have from this sort of post-Akkadian Neo-Sumerian period are from the king Ur-Bau. And I say king, but I actually shouldn't say king, because it's interesting. He never refers to himself as king. And actually, Gudea doesn't either. They abandon the term Lugal altogether. Instead, they adopt a term called Ensi. Ensi roughly translates to something like governor or overseer. It was a term that was used during the Akkadian Empire, right, as the overseers of these cities. They retain that instead of adopting, right, an honorific that would say, "Oh, I'm the king of a great city," or a series of cities. Ur-Bau and then Gudea take this title and retain this title, Ensi. So that's led some to think that, oh, well, maybe actually we do have, Lagash is being ruled by some external power during this time. But all of the records from Lagash at this time are all local. There's no reference to external kings. So again, we think that Lagash was largely independent, and the choice to abandon Lugal, which is only used in texts referring to gods. Lugal becomes something, an honorific that is only applied to gods at Lagash, is actually a term of respect, right? These are the kings of Lagash, or the Ensis of Lagash, really showing their humbleness. And we see that in their text too. Those that we have from Ur-Bau, which are very few, actually just talk about temple building for the most part. This changes with Gudea. Actually, these are some other stele from the period, Ur-Nammu, and this is a stele of Gudea, which we'll come back to in a moment. Here's a statue of Ur-Bau, and you can see already that the conventions are quite a bit different. It's a very blocky, interesting kind of statue, again carved out of diorite, and in it we see a shift to some new conventions. Conventions where, right, the king is standing in a pose of devotion, of piety, with his hands clasped against his chest. This is something that Gudea picks up on in his later statues. And Gudea is very much a different kind of king. He follows Ur-Bau's example. Ur-Bau sets himself to rebuilding all the temples of Lagash. With that foundation laid, Gudea takes power and ends up rebuilding 15 temples, not just in Lagash, but also in Girsu, which he makes his administrative center. And we can see already that Gudea is expanding control. At Girsu, actually, he rebuilds the temple to Ningirsu, who is the same god, right, which we saw on the stele of the vultures. And I think I have a shot of some of these temples here. This is a later reconstruction of this temple. Unfortunately, we don't have many of these temples. They were destroyed or looted, and they were excavated in the 1880s by Dsarzak, and we didn't find very much. But we do have clay cylinders that were found at the site that talk about the construction of these temples and how Gudea himself writes that he received the orders and the plan in a dream from Ningirsu himself. And these texts are really interesting because they talk about the rites that go into temple building, the way that he has to go about purifying the land to build the temple, and importing foreign craftsmen and materials for its construction. And we can see in these descriptions too that, again, Gudea's, while he's still saying that he's an Ensi, he's now taking control of other cities. He's reaching out, bringing foreign craftsmen in. He's even launching military campaigns. He's launching campaigns against Elam and Anshan. Only one, but still, these are the acts of more of a king as opposed to an Ensi. We read in his text the scope of his power. From Elam came the Elamites, from Susa the Susians. Gudea brought them together in his city Girsu. Gudea, the great end priest of Girsu, made a path into the Cedar Mountains that no one had ever entered before. And the Cedar Mountains, of course, right, being up in Lebanon. So again, very far to the north. He cut trees with great axes. And like great snakes, cedars were floating down the river, pine rafts before the pine mountain, right? Because you'd have to float these down through the, using the Tigris of the Euphrates. In quarries which no one had ever entered before, Gudea, the great end priest of Ningirsu, made a path, and the stone was delivered in large blocks. Many other precious metals were carried from the mountain to the builder of the Ninu temple. From the copper mountain of Kimdash, gold was delivered from its mountain as dust. Gudea then mined its silver from its mountains, delivered red stones, etc., etc., etc. You get the idea, right? This is Gudea again, talking in terms of his contacts, the scope of his power, but again, power that's being devoted for a god. So again, we see this emphasis in piety with Gudea, this emphasis on establishing himself, and this new use of material. Also, the fact that Gudea shifts to Girsu from Lagash. This is a shift that we can see as being very politically savvy. We talked about Sargon establishing Agade, right? Leaving Kish, establishing Agade because he wasn't of the dynasty, right? Well, if Gudea marries into this family, yes, he's portraying himself as this Ensi, as this, very humble servant of the gods. But like Sargon, he establishes a new capital. He moves outside of town, starts a new capital, reestablishes Girsu, and starts again from scratch. So a very politically savvy individual for all of his talk of piety and godliness. We find that many of these objects and inscriptions from Gudea are very striking, and among them we have these diorite statues, right? Diorite statues that are built on the model of the one by Ur-Bao. But in this case, we have at least 26 of these statues. You can actually go to the Louvre and see a great number of them, and it gets a little repetitive after a while because they really look the same over and over and over and over again. In fact, many of them were found collected in a later context. Again, this is that temple, the reconstructed temple of Gudea, and this is actually in the context of the 2nd century, where these statues were collected by a later Hellenistic king and set up in a central courtyard. He was kind of almost like a 2nd century museum. He was very interested in reestablishing what Gudea had achieved. And he brought all these statues together and arranged them inside this court, which gives us the false impression that Gudea might have been a megalomaniac or wanting to have so many statues of himself. But again, these statues were from separate contexts. Each one would have been set up in a temple in a very, very different religious context. So, in fact, actually, we see 2 types of statue. Again, a seated statue and a standing statue in the time of Gudea. And these statues were set off in pairs. We have these inscriptions that talk about who they are, what the statue's name is, and what function it served. And there would be a standing statue and a sitting statue, which would be paired off in a temple. We're not quite clear what their functions were, how they would interact together, but again, these are statues that are set up by Gudea for the purpose of maintaining and establishing and maintaining that connection with a particular divinity. In fact, every divinity in the Lagash pantheon, Gudea goes out of his way to dedicate 2 statues to, which will serve as his proxy. And again, making that relationship productive and safe. We see Gudea wearing what seems to be a very long woolen robe. And you'll notice that the headgear has changed. Gudea has adopted this very interesting kind of round Michelin tire of a hat with a very wide brim. Perhaps it's also made of wool, right? We see these little curly cues, this stylized woolen hat that he wears, abandoning that hair bun that's become so iconic of the Lugal, the king, right? Again, this is Gudea portraying himself as Ensi, but now NC of a very different type. These statues are varied in size. They range from over 5 feet to just about maybe 1 or 2 feet. And again, a lot of times they're made out of a solid block of stone. The fact that Gudea is able to get access to these stones again speaks to his trade contacts. Early statues of Gudea tend to be made out of limestone. They're made out of steatite, more locally available stones that are softer, easier to carve. By the end of his reign, everything's being made out of diorite. Everything's being devoted to the god. And actually, I'll just jump back here to Ur-Bao. Chances are, we only have one statue of Ur-Bao. It is made of diorite, but given how blocky and strange it is, it's possible it might have been a recarving of an earlier statue, and it's a one-off. Maybe Ur-Bao had a special expedition that just went to get this one block of stone. Gudea, right, again, 26 examples of this statue, this statue type, made out of hard diorite. And actually, Gudea goes out of his way to say that he uses diorite because it's so hard. He says, I would have made my statues out of lapis lazuli, but lapis lazuli is too soft. It'll break, and I want my statues to endure forever. And, and actually, true to form, 4,000 years later, they have survived, and we do have them in places like the Louvre. Cylinder seals. Cylinder seals during the time of Gudea, they reach back into the early dynastic period, but at the same time incorporate a whole bunch of new iconography. We see presentation scenes emerging during this period in which Gudea is not the god, he's actually being brought before the god, and brought before the god in a sort of reverent and sort of in awe. We see him being dragged forth and putting his hand before his face, almost to say, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. But again, he's being brought forth. In this case, he's being brought forth by a god named Ningishzida, who is Gudea's personal god, god devoted to his kingship and his reign. But we see him, again, being brought forward. This idea of piety, again, playing out in our glyptic art from the period. Also, in these cylinder seals, there's a throwback to the flowing vase motif. You might have caught this when we were looking at the art of the early dynastic period. We've seen on a few occasions these vases with water flowing out of them. And not just flowing out of them, right, but fish in them too. If you look, there are actually little tiny fish that are coming out of this vase. During the time of Gudea, he adopts this flowing vase motif, brings it forth, shows up in seal iconography, it shows up in his statues, and this is going to be a very important artistic motif later on. So just keep it in mind that Gudea sort of revives this, again, trying to bring back the Sumerian style in this Neo-Sumerian period. We're doing on time. Let's see here. Right. With these statues, all but 2 of them are inscribed, and again, each one is devoted to a particular god in the Lagash pantheon. But we do have these texts that talk about where they were set up and how they were supposed to be used, and each one has an explanation on it. A lot of times they're almost like Christmas gifts. They say, things like, "From Gudea, the one who built this temple, may his life be prolonged." Or things like, "To the lady, cherished daughter of the pure sky, the mother goddess Baba, in the temple, may she prolong the life of